Hi, it's Dwyer with part 2 of the Errol Spence's Dilemma video. Right? Let's talk about it. But, as always, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Before I dive further into Errol Spence, there's breaking news last few hours. The big fight, and it was going to be big, at cruiserweight between very important person. He's a southpaw. He's a slick southpaw. Opetaia and Richard Riakporhe appears to have fallen through. Right? Riakporhe is the second mandatory contender to decide he's not going to follow through with fighting Opetaia. Now, let's just pause for a moment and understand how important Opetaia is. You have a slick southpaw at heavyweight right now who, like Opetaia, can get on his back foot, can make you miss. If you're a righty and you're unfamiliar with southpaws, you're taking the first few rounds to figure him out. And by that point, Usyk is well ahead in the fight. He's figured you out. He's defensively blessed. Just understand, Opetaia has a lot of the same traits. He's not as defensively blessed, in my opinion, as Usyk is. But I need for folks to understand that if I were a heavyweight, and if I wanted to prepare for Usyk, one of the people I would consider fighting would be Opetaia. Right? He's slick. He moves. He moves more than, let's say, a Luis Ortiz. Right? Understand, too, you have a bigger margin of error with Opetaia because Ortiz can knock you out. Right? Charles Martin famously got stopped by Luis Ortiz. Opetaia, at least in terms of size and weight, is a smaller guy than Luis Ortiz. Right? So understand, Opetaia, heavyweights are fortunate that this cruiserweight hasn't done the math and hasn't figured out that today he would give Anthony Joshua, who's still acclimating to a new trainer and who has had 2 fights against a slick southpaw where he didn't quite figure out the angles, right? And Opetaia would give an Anthony Joshua stylistic problems. Understand, Opetaia got his jaw broken in 2 places by Maris Briedis, who was very front foot heavy. Understand, Briedis is sure of himself. He's not a hesitant heavyweight. With Briedis, he's coming after you. At heavy, we need to figure out how exactly an Anthony Joshua would navigate the first 6 rounds against Opetaia, who knows how to come in and out of the pocket. Right? Understand, too, when Luis Ortiz fought Deontay Wilder, right, the first fight, I thought Ortiz is winning every round. I thought Ortiz was well ahead when Wilder stops him. The judges saw it differently. Okay, fine. By the second fight, even the judges saw that Luis Ortiz was outboxing Deontay Wilder. Right? I need for people to understand that an Opetaia, because he's a mobile southpaw, would give Deontay Wilder problems. Right? So let's pay close attention to what happens to Opetaia. Just understand, Masternak and now Riakporhe have decided not to fight him, not to take a shot at the title. Right? Now, part of it might be that the other champion is Badu Jack. Right? An older guy who might be a little bit shop-worn, etc. Right? Maybe they have figured out that the path to a title might be easier fighting somebody else with the cruiserweight title. Maybe behind the scenes, they've gotten offers to fight some heavyweights where the big money is. In any event, just be aware of the fact that because he's a mobile, slick, boxing southpaw, former Olympian Opetaia really should be one of the more demanded fighters as an opponent in boxing because of the existence of Usyk. How else am I going to train to fight Usyk unless I consider at least sparring with Opetaia? If you believe that Usyk's southpaw orientation contributed to AJ's inability to make the adjustments, then one wonders why AJ isn't thinking about fighting Opetaia, right? Understand, if, Opetaia, in my opinion, doesn't have a big punch. If you're an aggressive heavyweight who understands you need to cut down on the angles, come in on him, right? Then, I'm surprised people aren't at least considering Opetaia as an opponent. Let's be clear, too. I've referred to Luis Ortiz. Understand there's another big, bad southpaw. It's a great era for heavyweight southpaws in the heavyweight division. And that's Zhilei Zhang, who already ended Joe Joyce's unbeaten streak, is set to fight Joe Joyce this fall. And I'm expecting Zhilei Zhang, and we'll talk about this in another video, to win that fight. Right? So let's give southpaw some recognition here. Now let's get back to Errol Spence. Understand how on the outside Errol Spence is. Right? Crawford gets to decide the weight class of their next fight. Let's say Errol Spence wants to fight his buddy, Charlo. Understand, Charlo is fighting Canelo. If Charlo beats Canelo, I don't think he ever comes back to 154. Even if Charlo loses to Canelo, because of the setup at middleweight, Charlo might decide he's going to fight in the middleweight division. Understand, right now on BoxRec, they have a 41-year-old Golovkin as the top middleweight. Let's get serious, too. Errol Spence wants to fight Charlo, even if Charlo came back down to 154. Which fight has more glamour for him if he's not going to fight against someone who's already in the 154-pound division? Right? Would Charlo's star shine more brightly if he fights Errol Spence? Or would it shine more brightly if he fights Terence Crawford, the man who just beat Errol Spence and who's unbeaten? Right? So if Errol Spence decides to go to 154, and understand, Floyd Mayweather feels that Errol Spence may have already outgrown the possibility of fighting at 154. I need for folks to understand that he's not going to beat Terence Crawford at 154, at least not in my opinion. That's if Crawford says, let's fight at 154, and doesn't put stipulations and addendums in the contract, right? Which he has the bargaining power right now to do. And understand, if he's going to fight Charlo, Charlo is one of the most sought-after men in boxing right now. Right? Charlo's fighting Canelo. If Charlo were to beat Canelo, and if there isn't an immediate rematch clause, do you think Charlo would lose the 13 pounds the 168 minus 154, the 12 pounds, to go back down to 154 and have an interim fight that would jeopardize a blockbuster financially rematch with Canelo? Why would he do that? And if he does that, would it be to fight Errol Spence? I think the answer would be no. Even if he returned to 154, his top priority would be Terence Crawford. Let's also point out, too, that some of the luster has gone out of a Crawford-Charlo fight or a Spence-Charlo fight, because by agreement with the sanctioning bodies, while Jermell Charlo will be announced at the Canelo fight as the undisputed champion at 154 pounds, understand he gets stripped of that designation right after the announcement. By agreement with the sanctioning bodies, understand one sanctioning body is going to strip Charlo right after he's announced as undisputed for the Canelo fight because he hasn't fought Tim Tszyu. Let me point out too, Tim Tszyu. Let's say Errol Spence decides, okay, I'm going to move up to 154. Isn't Tim Tszyu, who's front foot heavy, who comes looking for you, who's in a hurry, isn't Tim Tszyu exactly the wrong style for Spence coming off a loss who would be new at 154? Folks, that's a guaranteed shootout. Maybe Spence wins it, right? Maybe he wins it. But just understand the risk involved. Tim Tszyu might come out and might walk through Errol Spence. Right? Let's say Errol Spence is back in the saddle. He's thinking about his eye. He's thinking about the loss. He himself is wondering how he's going to, do in a new division. He hasn't been in a new division for years. And suddenly here's Tim Tszyu, who's not bashful. Here's Tim Tszyu, who was prepared to try to cut off the ring against Jermell Charlo. And Tim Tszyu is on his front foot looking for Errol Spence in a way that most of Spence's opposition outside of Sean Porter has not. Let me also say too, looking at Errol Spence's game, there's some holes, aren't there? Right? I believe it's Keith Thurman who pointed out that Errol Spence is a bit flat-footed these days. Right? I'm just telling you, I was waiting for Errol Spence, who's a southpaw, to throw an overhand straight right. And I didn't see him do it. I saw him throw some right hands, but it looked like to me, some left hands. It looked like to me something's not quite right with Errol Spence's left shoulder. It looks to me like Errol Spence really has to get inside on you at very short range. He doesn't really have the straight left power at mid-range. Right? If Tim Tszyu looks on film and reaches the conclusion that Errol Spence can't hit him with a straight left from mid-range, that might give Tim Tszyu the advantage. Right? Tim Tszyu might be able to stand at a certain range and pummel Errol Spence. Let's talk about Errol Spence at 160, one of the weight classes Floyd mentioned. Now, I'm just telling you, the first time you fight Golovkin, and I mean this, it's very hard against him because Golovkin's punches come in at an awkward curve. First, let's dispel any myth anyone has out there, any delusion that Spence hits as hard as Golovkin. He clearly doesn't. Right? Golovkin is a much harder puncher than Errol Spence. Let's also point out, too, that Golovkin's one of those guys who can literally run after a faster fighter. You remember the first Golovkin-Canelo fight. Canelo's on his back foot for part of that fight, and Golovkin is chasing him, closing the distance. You remember Golovkin against Kell Brook. Golovkin is going after Kell Brook, closing the distance. And Kell Brook has faster feet, in my opinion, than Errol Spence. Right? Golovkin has ridiculous ring coverage. Look at the Vanis Martirosyan fight. Right? So Errol Spence wouldn't be able to be on his back foot behind the jab and try to win a decision against Golovkin. Right? Golovkin can be outside, and like Deontay Wilder, his power travels. He doesn't have to be next to you to get leverage on shots. Right? So Golovkin, who's very two-handed, Golovkin, I believe, would batter Errol Spence. Let's talk about guys at 160 who Spence would be competitive against. I believe Spence would have a problem with Nursultatov. Right? Just understand that he's 6 feet tall. Right? As is Alim Kanuli, who I feel is the best in the division. Right? I think Kanuli is better than Golovkin. Right? Well, BoxRec has Nursultatov, who's 6 feet tall, ranked ahead of Alim Kanuli. But here's what you need to consider. Spence is a southpaw. Right? He just went up against southpaw Terence Crawford, who showed that a southpaw with a jab can batter Spence with that jab. One of Crawford's best punches was that right jab. Just understand, Alim Kanuli is a southpaw with a jab. He's also a better athlete than Errol Spence. So let's say Spence decides after getting battered by Crawford's jab, hey, my next fight's not going to be against a southpaw. Who could blame him? Just understand that Nursultatov is front foot heavy. Right? He's bigger than Spence. He's going to be on his front foot looking for Errol. That's a bigger man who would engage Spence in a firefight. Right? I believe Carlos Adames, who's also at 160, who's also highly rated, would engage Spence in a firefight. 160 is 13 pounds heavier than 147. The interesting opponents at 160, who are older, like Errol Spence, would be Chris Eubank Jr., who's 33 years old. And I believe this Eubank, and I know he got beaten by Liam Smith, but I believe he's one of the most complicated fighters, highly skilled, at 160. My fear with Eubank is that Eubank may be draining his body, likely is draining his body, to make 160, right? Because Eubank, of course, was fighting people at 168. So he might be the 160-pound equivalent of Errol Spence. But understand, Eubank is a technician, right? Eubank has improved his game. Although he got caught in the Liam Smith fight, I believe if he fought Smith 10 times, Eubank would win the majority of the 10. Right? I think because of what I view as some holes in Errol Spence's game. You could tell the holes just by looking at Spence's face. After the fight, he got touched up and roughed up, didn't he? After the Crawford fight. Wasn't there a time during the Crawford fight where you were thinking to yourself, why doesn't Spence do more to dodge Terence Crawford's jab? Weren't you thinking that, folks? Right? I would add in, too, that if you're fighting Eubank and you don't have a straight left, you're going to have problems. Well, I would say because Eubank's 33 and because Liam Smith is 35, and keep in mind, Smith is 5'9.5", so there isn't a big height gap at all between Errol Spence and Liam Smith. And because Smith doesn't hit as hard as Golovkin, and because when Smith faced Canelo, and understand, I consider Canelo to be defensively blessed, Smith was riddled to the body. In other words, it looks like Smith's defense to the body, where Errol Spence likes to feast, isn't top-notch, right? If Spence is looking for an opportunity at 160, it might be against Liam Smith, who, to my surprise, is ranked ahead of Zanabek Alimkhaluli, who I consider the best at 160. Right? So just to understand, if Spence takes Floyd Mayweather's advice, and folks, Mayweather knows boxing, right? If Spence takes that extra meal, allows his body to actually be at full strength for the weigh-in, if Spence goes up to 160, he has an intriguing fight against Liam Smith. If Spence, who is financially secure right now, that Crawford purse was a bonanza. If Spence at this point is really in it for the legacy, he could make a fight against Liam Smith a complete event. He can extend his brand by again crossing the Atlantic, he did so for Kell Brook, and fighting Liam Smith in the United Kingdom. Right? Just understand, if he does that, it's almost certain Chris Eubank would be ringside. Right? Understand too, if he beats Liam Smith, okay, then he could roll the dice. He'd have credibility at 160, and he could roll the dice against Golovkin. He could roll the dice against Chris Eubank. He could roll the dice against Alimkhaluli, who I think would beat him badly. Right? The problem Spence is going to have is that Liam Smith is not bashful. Liam Smith is going to come looking for him. Liam Smith is going to be on his front foot. Liam Smith is going to treat him like he's a welterweight, jumping up 2 weight classes to fight him. Right, so Spence really needs to think hard here. At 33, coming off a surgically repaired eye injury, does he want to continue fighting? Right, Marvin Hagler lost, at least that's what they tell us, to Ray Leonard and rode off into the sunset. Right, we still considered Marvin to have been a dominant fighter. Right, he lost to an all-time great. The same applies to Errol Spence. Spence has 1 loss. It's to Terence Crawford. Right, so does Spence want to push it here? How many of you consider Liam Smith to be a legendary opponent? How many of you know who Zanabek Alimkhaluli is? What happens if Spence at 33 fights a Golovkin who is 8 years older than him and loses to a guy in his 40s? How much of a hit to Spence's rep would that cause? Also, who, coming off eye surgery, then getting battered where the opponent lands more than 50% of his shots against him, right? How many guys like that would do well against Golovkin the first fight? Let me just say here openly, I felt Golovkin won his first 2 fights against Canelo. Right? That's how hard Golovkin is to fight, folks. He won his first 2 fights against Canelo on my scorecard. Right, now I'll agree, if you see Golovkin long enough, you can figure out the punch angles. But I'm just telling you that I don't believe Errol Spence at 33 is going to learn how to be as defensively savvy as Canelo is. Right? I thought Spence's face showed that he'd been hit more than I believe I've seen Canelo's face ever look like? And Canelo's been, obviously, he fights